The house on Ridgewood Crescent is still standing. 41 years, the same front porch, the same maple in the yard that I planted when my son was born. I drive past it sometimes and think about all the things that house absorbed. The arguments, the silences, the sound of a woman packing suitcases at 2 a.m. It's a solid house, red brick, modest yard, the kind of house a retired civil engineer with a pension and no interest in impressing anyone would live in. My name is Douglas Haynes. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years for the City of Ottawa's Infrastructure Department, came up through the ranks, retired with a clean record and a handshake from a deputy minister who mispronounced my last name. I don't own a boat. I don't vacation in Mexico. I buy my clothes at Mark's Workwear, and I make a beef stew on Sunday afternoons that I consider one of my genuine achievements in life. None of that mattered to my son on the evening of March 15th, at a restaurant in the Glebe, when he looked across the table at me and said, in front of his wife and his stepfather and 4 of their friends, "You know, Dad, you've always played it safe. Some people are built for comfort, and some people are built to win. You were always the first kind." He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed, evenly, with a small nod afterward, like he was confirming something he'd long believed. His stepfather, a man named Trevor Ashford, lifted his glass of Barolo and gave the quiet half-smile of a man who'd coached that line from the sidelines. I didn't respond. I picked up my fork. I finished the salmon. I drove home on the Queensway in the dark, past the orange glow of the Costco sign near Miravalle, past the overpass where I once watched a crew of my men re-pour a cracked section of concrete in February cold. I didn't feel the anger I thought I would feel. I felt something colder than anger, something that had been a long time forming. I poured myself 2 fingers of rye. I sat at the kitchen table. And I started making a phone call I had hoped, for 15 years, I would never have to make. My son's name is Patrick. He's 36. He came to me 6 years ago with a business plan for a property management company he wanted to launch in Ottawa. He called it Summit Property Group. The plan was half-baked. His projections were optimistic to the point of fantasy. His understanding of the regulatory environment was almost non-existent. But the core of it wasn't wrong. Ottawa's rental market was tightening. There was a gap. I could see it. What Patrick did not have was capital. He had energy and charm and a gift for talking to people, which are real things. But charm doesn't pay lawyers. What he wanted from me was a check and some quiet encouragement. What he didn't want was my opinion. So I gave him neither of those things. Not exactly. I told him the financing wasn't there for me. Told him my money was locked up in RRSPs and the pension, which was partly true. He was disappointed. He told me, not for the first time, that I thought too small. What I didn't tell him was that I'd spent 2 weeks running the numbers myself. The business could work with proper structure and patient money. And patient money was something I happened to have. I called a lawyer I'd been referred to by a colleague, a woman named Patricia Morrow, a corporate and estates lawyer in Canada who had a reputation for discretion and complicated structures. I told her what I had in mind. She listened without interrupting, which is a quality I deeply value in a professional. Then she said, "I can do this. Give me 2 weeks." What we built together over the following months was invisible. A numbered company in Ontario, 2847631, Ontario Inc., which served as a holding entity. Through it, I capitalized a private investment fund structured as a limited partnership. The general partner was a small advisory firm we set up in name only, with a retired accountant from Nepean serving as the nominal director. His name was on the documents. Mine was not. That fund became the seed investor for Summit Property Group. Patrick walked into what he believed was a meeting with an independent investment group called Ridgewood Capital Partners. He misspelled Ratto in his thank you email, which I noticed, and walked out with a commitment of $420,000 in exchange for a 60% equity stake. He called me that evening. I remember he was almost breathless. "Dad," he said, "you're not going to believe this. I found my investors." "That's good news," I said. "I'm glad for you." "It's a real group. Boutique operation. They really understood the vision. Good, I said. What are the terms? He explained them. I already knew every term. I had written every term. Sounds reasonable, I said. Read the shareholders' agreement carefully. I will, he said. He did not. Over the following years, I watched Summit Property Group grow. Patrick had real ability in the day-to-day tenant relations, property acquisition, building vendor relationships. He hired a woman named Sandra as his operations manager, who was frankly more competent than he was, and I quietly ensured she was well compensated. The company grew to manage 32 units in Centertown, Hintonburg, and the Glebe. Patrick believed he built it. He told that story constantly, at dinner parties, on his LinkedIn page. He once gave a talk at an Ottawa Board of Trade event about entrepreneurship that I attended without telling him. I sat in the back row. I listened to him describe how he'd pitched to investors, how he'd taken the leap when others wouldn't. I drove home thinking about whether I'd made a mistake, not in what I'd built for him, and the assumption that one day he'd see it. He didn't see it. He saw Trevor Ashford. Trevor came into my son's life the same way Trevor came into most things, through my ex-wife, Catherine, whom he'd been dating for 4 years by the time Patrick introduced us. Trevor ran a consulting firm. He wore pocket squares. He had strong opinions about wine. He referred to himself in conversation as someone who understood how value is created, and he said this often enough and with enough authority that my son, who was in his late 20s and still building, began to hear it as wisdom. It was Trevor who gave Patrick the vocabulary built to win. Comfort versus growth. Legacy thinking. These phrases began appearing in Patrick's sentences, secondhand furniture dressed up as original thought. Trevor's consulting firm, as best I could determine, had one client. That client was Summit Property Group, which paid Trevor a monthly advisory fee of $9,000 on a contract that Patrick had signed with great enthusiasm after Trevor had, in a genuine act of audacity, helped Patrick draft it. $9,000 a month, $108,000 a year, paid from company accounts that were funded by capital I had quietly provided and profits I had helped generate. I sat with that for a long time before March 15th. After the restaurant, I sat with it differently. I called Patricia Morrow the next morning. It was a Tuesday. She picked up herself, which she always does before 9. Patricia, I said. It's Douglas. I know, she said. I have call display. You sound like someone who had a rough evening. I had a clarifying evening, I said. I'd like to meet. I'll move my 10 o'clock, come in at 9:30. Her office is in a low-rise on Hertzberg Road, near the Canadian Tire Center. Practical woman. Practical office. She had coffee made when I arrived. I told her about the dinner. She listened the same way she always listened. Not with sympathy exactly, but with full attention, like a doctor taking down symptoms. I want to activate the shareholder provisions, I said. Everything in the LP agreement. She set down her cup. You're sure? I've been sure since about 11 o'clock last night, I said. I just wanted to sleep before calling you. The 60% stake is clear, she said. The general partner can call a restructuring review under Section 9 of the LP agreement. We trigger that first. It gives the majority shareholder the authority to conduct an audit of company operations and suspend executive signing authority pending review. Timeline? We can issue the review notice by end of week. Signing authority suspended effective 7 days after notice. If we're also terminating the advisory contract, we are. That's cleaner. The advisory contract has a performance clause we built in at my suggestion, if you recall. Measurable deliverables that were never properly documented by the advisor. We can argue non-performance. I did recall I had suggested it, and she had agreed it was prudent. And the vehicle? I said. Patrick drove a 2022 Volvo XC60, dark blue. The lease was held through Summit's fleet account, a company expense, tied to his role as CEO. If his executive authority was suspended during audit, the eligibility for company-provided vehicle fell away. The lease is through the numbered company's asset management subsidiary, Patricia said. The moment the restructuring review begins and signing authority is suspended, his authorization as a company officer lapses. The vehicle reverts. I nodded. Start with the vehicle, I said. Like pulling the thread. She wrote something on her notepad. Then she looked up. Doug, can I ask you something personal? You can try. Is this about Patrick, or is it about Trevor? I looked at my coffee. It's about what I should have done 5 years ago, I said. I confused keeping quiet with being patient. They're not the same thing. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. Let's begin. I spent Thursday and Friday doing what I do when I need to not think about something. I changed the winter tires on my truck. I cleaned out the gutters on the south side of the house, which I'd been putting off since October. On Saturday, I drove out to my sister's place in Almonte and helped her husband rehang a gate on their fence that had been dragging all winter. On Saturday evening, my phone rang. It was Patrick. I watched it ring. The third time it went to voicemail, I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove the county road back toward the city in the dark. He left a message. I didn't listen to it until Sunday morning, standing in my kitchen making oatmeal. Dad, my car wasn't in the building garage when I went down this morning. There's some issue with the lease, they said. The fleet company. I need you to call me back. There's something going on and I don't know what it is. Call me back, please. I ate my oatmeal. I went to Mass. I sat in the third pew from the back at St. Patrick's Basilica, which is where I've sat for 20-some years, and I listened to the gospel reading, which happened to be about the prodigal son, which I chose to find amusing rather than pointed. Monday came hard. Patrick arrived at Summit's office on Rochester Street to find his key fob no longer open to the back entrance. The building manager, who had been quietly briefed, redirected him to the main entrance and handed him an envelope. Inside was a formal notice, on legal letterhead, informing Summit Property Group that the majority shareholder of record, Ridgeo Capital Partners, acting through the LP general partner, had initiated a full operational and financial audit under Section 9 of the shareholders' agreement. Effective immediately, executive signing authority for Patrick Haynes was suspended pending completion of the audit. All company accounts were frozen except for operating accounts accessible by the CFO, which was Sandra, who had been promoted to interim managing director that morning by board resolution. Sandra, to her credit, called Patrick directly. She told him she was as surprised as he was, and that she hoped it would be resolved quickly. She was not lying about the first part. He called me 4 times Monday afternoon. I didn't answer. He sent 3 texts. The third one said, Dad, I know something is happening. Please call me. I need to know you're okay. That one I found harder to read than I expected. Tuesday, Trevor discovered the advisory contract had been terminated. Patricia had sent the notice by registered mail to his business address, a shared office suite on Bank Street, and also by email. The grounds were non-performance against documented deliverables. The notice also indicated that Summit would be seeking partial recovery of fees paid under the contract, pending audit findings. I know what happened next because Catherine called me. We don't speak often. When we do, she is generally composed. She was not composed on Tuesday afternoon. Douglas, she said, and her voice had that particular quality it gets when she's frightened, which I recognized from a long time ago. What have you done? Hello, Catherine. Trevor's contract has been canceled. His accounts are frozen. He said there's a legal notice claiming repayment. Douglas, we have a mortgage payment due Friday. The car payment. I understand, I said. You did this. I know you did this. This is because of what Patrick said at dinner, isn't it? This is spite. Catherine, I said, I've been funding Trevor's lifestyle for 4 years to a company I own. I've decided to stop. There was a silence that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. What do you mean a company you own? She said. You should ask Patrick to explain it, I said. Ask him to show you the shareholders' agreement. Have him read it this time. Douglas, I hope you and Trevor work things out, I said. I mean that genuinely. But this isn't mine to fix. I hung up before she could answer. Then I sat on the back porch and watched a pair of Canada geese land on the ice at the edge of the creek behind the houses on my street. They looked confused. It was mid-March, and the ice was still there. They stood on it for a while, then walked off. Patrick came to the house on Wednesday evening. I'd expected it. I left the front door unlocked and sat in the study. He knocked. Then he opened it and called my name. I said I was in the study. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, which was probably accurate. His coat was still on. He stood in the doorway. "Dad," he said, "you have to tell me what's happening." "Sit down, Patrick." "I don't want to sit down. I want to know, sit down." He sat in the chair across from my desk. The same chair where I used to sit with him when he was 9 years old, and we'd do his math homework together on Saturday mornings. He used to bring a glass of orange juice and sit on the corner of the desk, and I would move it 6 inches so it wasn't next to my papers. We did that every weekend for 2 years. I opened my laptop. I turned it to face him. On the screen was the incorporation document for 2847631 Ontario Inc., with my name listed as sole director. Next to it, open in another window, was the limited partnership agreement for Ridgeo Capital Partners, showing the same numbered company as controlling interest. And next to that was the shareholders' agreement for Summit Property Group, with Ridgeo Capital Partners holding 60%. He stared at the screen. "You remember Ridgeo Capital," I said. "Your investors." He said nothing. "I set up the numbered company in 2018. Patricia Morrow, you've never met her, handled the structure. The retired director listed on the documents is a man named Gerald, who was paid a modest annual fee to have his name on a letterhead. He had nothing to do with the operation. I directed everything." Patrick's mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. The $420,000 that funded Summit came from my retirement savings and the proceeds from the rental property I sold in 2017. The one on Carling I inherited from your grandfather. You knew I sold it. You didn't ask what I did with the money. "Dad, I'm not finished." He closed his mouth. "You own 20% of Summit Property Group. That 20% was a gift, structured as a founder's equity grant. The 60% held by my LP has always carried majority governance rights. That's in the agreement you signed without reading." I paused. Sandra read it, by the way. She asked 2 questions when we first drafted it. Good questions. He looked like a man who had just learned that the ground under a building he'd stood on for years was not solid, which was accurate. "Devolvo," I continued, "is on a fleet lease through a subsidiary of the numbered company. Your authorization to use it was tied to your role as signing officer. When the audit suspended your authority, the vehicle authorization lapsed. It was repossessed Friday morning." The lease company said Fontaine Patrimoine. That was the French version. Different project. This one is called Summit Fleet Assets Inc. Same structure, different name. I have a filing system. He was quiet for a long moment. "Trevor," he said finally. His voice had changed. Quieter. "Trevor's consulting contract was with Summit," I said. "Funded entirely by company accounts, which are funded by my capital. $9,000 a month. I want you to think about that for a moment, where that money came from, and where it went." I let that sit. "He has no other clients," I said. "I had that verified 18 months ago. His only income was the Summit contract. The mortgage on the house he shares with your mother, her car, their vacations. All of it ran through those monthly payments." Patrick stared at the desk. "The man who told you that some people are built to win," I said. "His entire life for 4 years has been paid for by the man he was calling comfortable." I closed the laptop. He didn't speak for a while. The furnace clicked on. Outside, a car went past on Ridgewood Crescent, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of the study. "I'm not taking the company from you," I said. "Patricia is conducting a real audit. There are some expense irregularities we need to clean up, nothing catastrophic. And then Sandra will continue as managing director under a restructured board. Your 20% is still yours. Your role going forward will be in business development, which is where your actual ability is. Sandra manages operations. That's how it should have been structured years ago. You could have just told me, he said. His voice was very quiet. I tried, I said. Several times, over several years. You weren't interested in what I knew. You were interested in what Trevor knew. He had no answer for that. I'm not angry with you, I said. And I meant it, which surprised me somewhat. I was, for a while. But anger is not what I feel now. I feel like a man who let something go on too long because he thought patience and silence were the same as love. They're not. He was looking at his hands. Go home, I said. Think. Call me when you're ready to have a different kind of conversation. He got up. He put his coat back on. He walked to the front door, and I heard him pause there. Then the door opened and closed, and I heard him walk down the porch steps. I sat there for a while in the quiet. Then I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. I found the good tea, the loose-leaf stuff my sister brings me from a place in Perth, Ontario, and I made a pot of it. I took it to the back porch. The night was cold, but not the punishing cold of January. It was the cold of late winter, the kind that has some give in it. The geese were back, or different geese. Hard to tell in the dark. They were standing at the edge of the creek making the low sounds geese make when they're settling in. My phone buzzed, not Patrick this time. It was a number I didn't recognize, which I normally don't answer, but it was late, and something made me pick it up. It was Trevor. His voice was tight and controlled in the way of someone who is used to performing control but is not feeling it. Douglas, he said, I think we should talk man to man. All right, I said. I want to understand what you're trying to accomplish here. I don't think I need to explain that, I said. This has consequences beyond just Patrick, Catherine. She's not well positioned for this kind of disruption. I know, I said. Then you understand why I'm asking you to reconsider. I looked out at the creek. The geese had gone still. Trevor, I said, you spent 4 years advising my son on my money, while building a lifestyle that would collapse the moment I stopped paying for it. You sat across a table from me in March and smiled while my son called me comfortable. I don't think you get to call me and ask for reconsideration. A pause. I'm going to rebuild, he said. I want you to know that. I hope you do, I said. Genuinely, that would be good for my son's mother, and I still care about her well-being even if we're not together. But that's your work to do, not mine. I ended the call. The geese shifted, and one of them made a low sound like a door hinge, and then they were quiet again. There's a version of this story where I feel triumphant, where I sit on my back porch in the cold with my tea and feel like a man who won something. That's not quite how it felt. What it felt like was the end of a long period of confusion. Confusion about whether love means giving without limit, whether staying quiet when you're dismissed is patience or cowardice. I had told myself for years that I was being the bigger person, that I was supporting my son's growth by stepping back, that my invisibility was a gift. Maybe some of it was, but some of it was fear. Fear that if I said what I knew, if I asked to be seen, I'd lose him entirely. What I didn't understand until March 15th was that I had already lost something. Not Patrick. Patrick was still there, still my son. What I'd lost was the honest version of our relationship, the one where he knew who I was and I knew who he was. We'd been performing something for years, both of us. Him performing the self-made man. Me performing the self-made man. Me performing the quiet supporter who didn't need acknowledgement. Patrick called me 10 days later, a Sunday. I was in the garden, turning the soil in the raised beds I built 10 years ago out of cedar boards. Dad, he said. Patrick. I talked to Sandra, he said. She walked me through the shareholders' agreement. All of it. Good. She said she knew about the structure, that you'd told her when you promoted her. I did. She deserved to understand what she was managing. He was quiet for a moment. I kept working the soil with the garden fork. I've been thinking about what you said, he said, about patience and love not being the same thing. And I think you let me get away with a lot because you didn't want to fight with me. I think I knew that, and I used it. I stopped working. That's an honest thing to say, I said. I'm sorry about the dinner, he said. I've been sorry since the next morning, if I'm being truthful. I knew it was wrong when I was saying it. I was performing for Trevor and I didn't stop myself. The maple in the yard was starting to show the first suggestion of buds. Still tight, barely there. But they were there. Come for dinner Sunday, I said. I'll make the beef stew. Come alone. We'll talk. He came. He came alone. I will tell you this. I don't know what happens next with Patrick. I don't know if the version of us that sits down to a meal in my kitchen on Ridgewood Crescent, talking like two men who are actually honest with each other. I don't know how long that lasts or what form it takes. I hope it becomes something real. What I know is this. I spent 63 years being the kind of man who gets called comfortable. The kind of man who is thanked at the end of his career with a handshake and a mispronounced name. The kind of man who buys sensible clothes and drives a sensible truck and thinks that being useful and invisible is a form of grace. Maybe it is. But grace, I've learned, is not the same as permission. Not the same as an invitation to look right through someone. I built my son a house, and when he stood on the front step of that house and told the neighborhood I was a failure, I took the house back. Not out of cruelty. Not out of anger, in the end. Because a man who has spent 30 years in infrastructure knows this, if you let a crack go long enough, it doesn't heal. You have to open it up, clean it out, and pour it fresh. That's all I did. I've been turning this over for months now. The way you turn a stone over in your hand without really knowing what you're looking for underneath it. What I keep coming back to is this. Patrick didn't become the person who said those words at that restaurant table overnight. That took years, and I was present for all of it. I was there every time I absorbed a dismissal without saying anything. Every time Trevor made one of his little pronouncements about how value is created, and I nodded politely. Every time I funded a lifestyle I wasn't acknowledged for, and told myself that being useful in silence was a kind of strength. It wasn't. It was a habit I dressed up as virtue. There's a version of cause and effect that's easy to understand. You do something wrong, something bad happens to you. That's not what happened here, and I think that's worth being honest about. Patrick isn't a bad person. Trevor isn't a villain in the way that word usually means. What happened at that restaurant in the Glebe was the result of something slower and quieter, a long accumulation of small choices made by all of us that nobody stopped to examine. Patrick chose to perform for Trevor instead of being honest with me. Trevor chose to build a life on a foundation he didn't earn and didn't question. I chose to stay invisible and call it patience. Consequences, I've found, aren't always punishment. Sometimes they're just the shape that reality takes when you stop managing the distance between yourself and the truth. What I think about when I think about ethics, real ethics, not the kind you read about in a textbook, is that it lives in the small decisions, in whether you read a contract before you sign it, in whether you acknowledge where your money comes from, in whether you say something honest to your father at a dinner table or perform for the men sitting next to him. Patrick had the intelligence for all of those things. He has a sharp mind. What he was missing for a long time was the discipline to use it on himself instead of pointing it outward. That's the part I think is worth sitting with. Intelligence without honesty is just a better tool for building the wrong things. And resilience, the kind that actually holds, doesn't come from never being knocked down. It comes from being willing to stand in a room with the truth about yourself and not leave. Patrick did that eventually. He sat across from me in my study and he said, I knew it was wrong when I was saying it. That took something real. I'm 63. I spent 31 years building things that would last, and I think the habit carried over. I built a structure around my son's company because I believed in what it could be, and I stayed in it long enough to see whether he would grow into it. I'm still not sure he has, not entirely, but the conversation we're having now, the real one, is more than I had a year ago. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's simpler than it sounds. The people who never demand to be seen eventually disappear, and not always in ways that are good for anyone, showing up fully. Being honest about what you built, what you've given, what you won't accept. That's not arrogance. That's just the basic requirement of being in an actual relationship with another person. I went back to the garden the following Sunday. The cedar raised beds needed another round of work. The maple was leafing out properly by then, the way it does every April without fail, without being asked, on its own schedule. Some things hold. You just have to give them the right conditions.